Back here at the Matt Blatt Kia Studios, Nick Costco with you on 97.3 ESPN. We're going to switch gears for a moment. We're going to talk some hockey. Who would have thunk it? In December, with how bad they've been playing so far this year, we're going to talk some Flyers hockey off the debut of Carter Hart, and Dave Isaac is kind enough to join us. He covers the Flyers for the Courier-Post and USA Today. Dave, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
So I have to start out with this team, how differently they played last night. I mean, you look at the debut of Carter Hart. He's a 20-year-old. It could be the franchise goalie, interim head coach. It's at home. You have to go over the mood of that building last night, knowing that it's kind of like a fresh start, a good portion into the season.
It is for the fan base. That's probably the way that they looked at it. I would imagine is a clean slate. You got a relatively new general manager, new coach on an interim basis, and the goalie that everybody's been talking about was called up and going to get the start. It was clearly a game where the Flyers were hoping to get some excitement going there. Now, if you put yourself in the locker room, I think it's a completely different vibe where you're seeing all that turmoil, firsthand. Your coach is no longer there, so there's somebody else that you're trying to make a really good first impression for. The team has been dead last in the NHL in terms of a home record. You've got the kid that everybody says is going to be the franchise savior in goal. So amid all the uncertainty, you're saying to yourself, we need to play a really good defensive game and not let this poor kid get shelled. After the Flyers have been pumping him up for the last 24 hours and putting out tweets saying, okay, come down tonight and see him play and buy his jersey and all that. There was a lot going on for the Flyers. And as you mentioned, they looked like a bit of a different team. How much of that was just kind of, fight or flight taking over in a moment of panic for the whole organization, and how much of that was things clicking, it's a little tough to read. But clearly they looked a little bit different last night than they had the last several weeks.
Now, talk about that defense a little bit. Obviously, when Dave Hakstol was the head coach, he was criticized a lot for the lines he would put out, the healthy scratches. So that defense is really young. Talk about what they did differently, if anything, or just how they simply played last night, because usually when we talk about Flyers goalies, I know that they've had a rotating cast for so many years, but a lot of the times it was the poor defensive play that led to a lot of these goals being given up. But I thought, at least last night, the defense put Carter Hart in a lot of safe situations for him to make some good saves. Talk about how that defense played last night.
Yeah, it was a little different. Like, every coach is going to have guys that he trusts, right? And Dave Hakstol, it was the veteran guys that he relied on to go out in the really tight situations, and they didn't always do the job, but he always felt that they were the ones that he could count on. Towards the end of his tenure there was a lot of instability with those lines. I mean, you saw that Western Canada road trip. If you stayed up late enough to watch that game, nearly everybody played with everybody. I think Nolan Patrick was on each of the four lines in 4 consecutive games. I mean, everything was all over the place. But towards the end, they did have Travis Sanheim, who was one of those guys that wasn't playing a big role for Dave Hakstol, playing with Ivan Provorov. And Sanheim has had a really pretty good season. The Flyers' defense as a whole hasn't been great, but he has been relatively stable in what was a pretty small role. So for him to be on the top pair towards the end of Dave Hakstol's tenure, I think they tried it out in the one game in Vancouver, and Scott Gordon went with it again last night. Scott Gordon coached Sanheim for a year and a half in Lehigh Valley, so that level of trust was there for Sanheim last night. He said after the game, it wasn't foreign for me to have him out there in those tough situations. So you saw a little bit of different personnel usage. But in terms of the defense, like if you look at their numbers, the chances that they've given up really haven't been too many. But the high-quality ones that they do give up, it's like, boy, oh boy, everything went wrong on that play. So it's kind of feast or famine for them in a lot of ways this season, and defense has been one of them.
Now, before we dive into Hart and the potential youth movement now for the Flyers, the defense itself, and in particular a guy like Sanheim, obviously he's playing alongside guys like Provorov and Gostisbehere. So you look at these young defensemen. Now that there's a different coach at the helm now, you have a rookie goaltender behind them. do you anticipate more of the, I would say, younger lineups for the Flyers, particularly on the defensive side? Because we've seen flashes, particularly from Gostisbehere and Provorov, that these guys actually could potentially one day be elite defensemen. Do we see now a lot of rotations where you're going to feature those three guys in particular moving forward for the rest of the season?
Yeah, I think everything's still up in the air because everything's still so new. Like the whirlwind is still going, even though nobody's been fired yet today, we don't think. But everything's been so uncertain that it's tough to know what Chuck Fletcher is going to do if these pieces are going to be here for the rest of this year or not. And even for a guy like Carter Hart, yesterday, I don't know whose decision it was to call Carter Hart up, to be quite honest, but it sure helped the Flyers from a public perception to have people in the stands for the game last night. By the sounds of everything that Fletcher has said and even Scott Gordon has said, they haven't committed to, yeah, he's ready and he's going to be up here for the rest of the year. It's like, well, we're going to see if this works or not. So I'm not even confident enough to say that Hart would be in goal tomorrow or Saturday. Now they've got so few options because Anthony Stolarz and Brian Elliott are both injured and aren't coming back anytime soon. So do you have Michael Neuwirth, who's played only 2 games and been terrible? Or do you call up Alex Lyon, who doesn't look quite right and hasn't really this season at the NHL level at least? They've got to put somebody in there. Do they bring somebody in via trade? There's so many things that could happen. But I wouldn't commit to saying Carter Hart's going to be here indefinitely. I'm not so sure that's going to be the case.
It's actually interesting you say it, because my next question was going to be, if you're the Flyers, do you play Carter Hart for this next game and give him some of these challenges? Obviously, they're playing some good teams coming up. I mean, at least if I'm the Flyers, you have to give this kid experience because you just said it. They have 2 goalies injured. One guy's already back in the AHL, and Neuwirth's played 2 games and has looked bad this season. So if you're the Flyers, do you just ultimately, or at least should you, stick with Carter Hart despite the fact that he's 20 years old and you, I guess maybe in a sense, don't want to shatter his confidence if he has one bad game?
Yeah, I think you're kind of playing with fire there. Like Scott Gordon said last night, Hart really just started coming into his own in the last 5 games at the American League level. Now, the Nashville Predators are one of the best teams in the Western Conference. Columbus is probably the best team. I don't know if it's reflects in the standings right now. I know they're up there. I think Washington might be the actual number 1 seed, but Columbus is pretty darn close to being the best team in this division. Do you really want to throw them to the Wolves? There's no easy nights in the NHL, but Detroit was a game that was probably a good starter game for him. You know what I mean? So I don't know. There's an NHL trade freeze, a roster freeze tonight at midnight. Does Chuck Fletcher make a move and bring in another goalie before then? I don't know. There have been rumors for weeks ever since he was hired that was going to be number 1 on his priority list. We'll see, but I wouldn't think that Hart is going to get a lot of action here this weekend against those really talented teams.
A couple more things on Carter Hart. When you look at what he did last night, before we analyze his future, even for tomorrow, you look at what he did last night. 20 years old. His family was there. It was a nice moment post game where he got the puck for his first career win. What does that exactly do to a team where you have this is a team with a mix of veterans, guys like Claude Giroux, the captain, who's been here for a long time. What does a guy like Carter Hart do to those veterans and even the other young guys on the team, being able to win a tight game like that, playing well in his debut? Can that ultimately lift a team? And not to say they're going to go on a run now, but can that lift a team and kind of bring them out of this huge hole they've been in the first part of the season?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's been so much pressure on Carter Hart's shoulders even before he got called up for his first NHL game. And he's been in pressure situations before, not so much in his limited time as a professional, but the World Junior Tournament the last 2 years, that's a huge deal in Canada. You have a whole nation's weight on your shoulders. So if he was able to handle that and win a gold medal last year, I really wouldn't question his ability to handle it mentally going forward. As it were with last night, a lot of the guys mentioned after the game that he did give them a spark. But if you didn't have a spark in that game after a new coach, after a terrible road trip, if you weren't playing like your hair was on fire last night, I don't know how you got in the lineup, quite frankly. So whether he was the one that brought a spark to the Flyers roster last night, or if it was just all the scenarios that were kind of playing themselves out over the last days and weeks here, things worked right last night, for sure.
When you look at Scott Gordon as the interim head coach, obviously his future is going to be up in the air all season long. Do you think he is ultimately not going to be the head coach, or either he's put back on the AHL team, or he's kept on the staff as an assistant coach when they hire a new head coach? Where do you think the Flyers exactly go from here in terms of their coaching search? I mean, are they going to actually give Gordon a chance to prove himself? Or obviously all those reports that they were linked to Joel Quenneville. What is in the Flyers' what are they exactly dealing with here in terms of what they're going to do at arguably the most important position in the organization right now?
Well, I mean, Joel Quenneville is their number one target. That's kind of always been the case. He's been the apple of the eye of Flyers upper management for quite some time now. So that still remains the goal. I reported the other day that it was done. It was not done, obviously, but they were close. They were far down that road. So we'll see how quickly they can try and make something happen there. That remains their goal. When that happens, do they give Quenneville, if it does, do they say you can bring on whoever you want, and if that pushes Scott Gordon out, maybe. I've heard that they are looking for somebody at the American League level, so maybe that does push Scott Gordon out if Quenneville does bring his own guys and they, find somebody to replace Gordon down there. But I guess that's the risk that you take when you're offered an interim position, right? So, that might be the case for Scott Gordon, that he's kind of only doing this for half a season or what's left of it.
Dave Isaac joining me on the Boardwalk Honda hotline. You can follow him on Twitter at Dave G. Isaac. Covers the Flyers for Courier Post and USA Today. Dave, as far as what this team's future looks like, again, we really can't expect this team to go on a run and maybe sneak into the postseason like they have the past couple of seasons. But you look at the young guys they have on the team. They have a mix of veterans. I mean, you would think on paper they'd be a more solid hockey team. But what do you think the future lies for the Flyers here? I mean, I know we're still ways away from the season's end, but at this rate, are we going to see more of a youth movement for the Flyers and maybe the ship off of some of these veterans by the trade deadline, or even whether they just hang on to them until season's end?
Well, I think there's a little bit of wait and see there, because every time Chuck Fletcher talks about the future, he's really talking about the February 25th trade deadline in mind. So a lot can change between now and then. Do they try and still go for it now? What are they, 6 points out of a playoff spot, or maybe 8 if the last place team won that they were chasing? There's still a little bit of time for them to try and make that push. Like you said, it's unlikely, but it was also unlikely for them to really just drop like a sack of potatoes down to the basement of the Eastern Conference. So maybe they can go on a little short run here and change some minds and keep the gang together again, and maybe they add instead of subtract. It's a little too early to tell, even now, even where they are in the standings, to try and predict what's going to happen down the road here. But I think that either one of those things could happen. They could be buyers, they could be sellers. I could really see it going either way, but it's going to take the next probably couple weeks here to tell that story.
I know they're going into the freeze, as you mentioned before, but if you were in their position, and I know you just said you could see it going either way, whether they're going to be buyers or sellers, but if you're in the Flyers' position, based on what you have on the roster right now, you had Carter Hart's debut last night, you have an interim head coach, you might get Joel Quenneville at some point. At this rate, should the Flyers actually still be trying to go for it, or would they not close up shop, but kind of sell off some pieces, cut some loose ends, and get ready for the next season? Or would you actually still go for it in case you can make a run at the playoffs?
In my opinion, it's too early to deem yourself sellers. Like, the Flyers' goaltending has been bottom of the league. I would go out and get a goalie, not somebody that's going to box Carter Hart out for the future, but somebody who can give you a legitimate chance now, somebody who could give the guys that are here. I mean, Claude Giroux just, completely turned his career around last year, became an MVP candidate, carried the Flyers on his back the last month of the season, drugged them into the playoffs. He's been just as good this season. Like, you got to give him a fair shot. If people, question how much time does this core have left, just in terms of their quality of play, not necessarily how much time do you give them to do it? But their prime years, you got to give them a chance and get them somebody who can play in goal. I think that's the move I would make right now before you say, okay, let's try again for next season.
Dave Isaac joining me on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline, covers the Flyers for the Courier-Post and USA Today. You can follow him on Twitter at Dave G. Isaac. Dave, really appreciate the time this afternoon. We'll see what the Flyers do heading into the holiday break, of course, and we'll see what the future lies for Carter Hart. Appreciate the time as always, pal. Great stuff.